Well, good morning, youth. Yesterday, we began looking directly at the story of the Exodus. Seeing God's great salvation in the Exodus freed his people from slavery, but they weren't freed to go off and be on their own. They weren't free to control their own lives. They were free to live for God, to worship him, to serve him. And that's true of our salvation. Salvation frees us not from all masters, including God, but from all other masters for God, to surrender to him like Reptilis surrendered to the love of his kid. Today, we're still in Exodus 1 in the beginning part of chapter 2, and we're going to see more about this salvation, how God sets it up. Because it starts out pretty well for the people. They're reproducing a lot. They're being blessed in the land, but it goes south really quickly. There's this Pharaoh who arises, who doesn't remember Joseph, who didn't know Joseph, and so he oppresses them because he's afraid of their reproduction. Look at verse 10. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join with our enemies, fight against us, and escape from the land. Then verse 11, they afflicted them with heavy burdens. Verse 12, they were oppressed. Verse 13, they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves. Verse 14, made their lives bitter with hard service. None of that slowed down the Jews' prosperity, though. Pharaoh is worried that they will escape. So he's trying to curb their reproduction. None of that did it. So instead, he gets the midwives to kill the babies. Yet the midwives chose not to kill the male babies. And in fact, by the way, there's a little detail here that's important. We get the names of these midwives, these Egyptian midwives that were fairly insignificant at the time. We don't get the name of Pharaoh. The guy that every historian would love to know which Pharaoh this was. That doesn't matter in God's story. It doesn't matter which Pharaoh this was. He's just an evil leader. These women, though, that no historian would really care about because they're insignificant Egyptian women, they matter in God's story because they did God's work and God blessed them. But getting back to the story, that doesn't work. So Pharaoh finally commands that all the baby boys be killed by being thrown in the Nile. Go back and read chapter 1 and see it for yourself. Now, what do you think the Israelites must have felt like at this point? The oppression just keeps getting worse and worse. Don't you think they felt abandoned by God? Don't you think they would have said things like Psalm 22:1, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or Psalm 88, oh Lord, why do you cast my soul away? Why do you hide your face from me? I bet they felt that way. They probably knew the promises God had made to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. And yet right now it seems like God's abandoned them, since Pharaoh seems to have free reign to oppress them and even kill their children, infanticide. I bet they ask, where are you, God? Like Joseph felt in the previous story, they probably felt abandoned by God. Yet Moses here too writes subtly to show us that God may be absent from the text, but he is not at all absent from what's going on. Remember, like we talked about in the story of Joseph, God's providence is his sovereign power used for the good of his people, like you, like me, like the Israelites in this story. And when you read it, do you see that in here? It's there. Pharaoh is doing everything he can to control this Jewish population, yet everything he does not only backfires on him, but even brings about the very thing that he's trying to avoid. He's trying to avoid them escaping from Egypt, but watch what happens. First, in verse 10, he thinks that their growth will go unchecked, and so that they might turn up against him and might get away. So he tries to oppress them to stop their human reproduction. And from a human standpoint, that's not a bad idea. But it doesn't work. They keep reproducing. The more they were oppressed, the more they reproduced. So Pharaoh decides to amp up the volume. He initiates the more oppression, but the more they were oppressed, the more they reproduced. He amps up the volume even more by initiating the secret infanticide program, telling the midwives to kill them at birth, probably to make it look like they died naturally at birth. But the midwives don't do that. And God blesses them, and God blesses the people. And yet you know the rest of the story goes. The final step is the blatant murder of the children by throwing them in the Nile. Yet in this step, God is doing the very thing that Pharaoh is trying to avoid. You guys know the story, but think about this. If Pharaoh had never initiated this last step, Moses would never have been put in the Nile by his mother. And if Moses hadn't been put in the Nile by his mother, he would not have been found by Pharaoh's daughter, raised as her son, raised as a national leader in Pharaoh's court. If he had never been raised as a national leader in Pharaoh's court, he would not have had to flee when he murdered an Egyptian. If he had not had to flee when he murdered an Egyptian, he would not have come back as God's tool to liberate the people from Egypt. Everything that Pharaoh does only sets in motion God's plan to free the Egyptians. That is God's providence. That is how God works. Now, it would have been difficult for the Jews to see this at the time because they're right in the middle of it. They can't see what God's doing. Yet when they look back on it, they could see how God was working. The same is true for us. When we are in the middle of what God is doing, it's really hard for us to see how he's working his providence. Yet when we can look back on it, we can see he was never absent, but always working behind the scenes, always setting up the dominoes for his goals and his purposes, which is for his glory and the good of his people. So God is working an unstoppable plan. When you ask, where are you, God? Cling to stories like this that show God is always faithful to his promises. You guys think about that. I'll see you tomorrow.